0702701. Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet little nook of history. Settle in, rest your tired thoughts, and allow me to share with you stories from a world long past. Before we step into the shadowy alleys and sun-drenched fields of the Middle Ages, I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Is it morning where you are, or are you gently nestled beneath your covers, seeking calm at the end of a long day? If you find comfort in these soft musings of days gone by, consider subscribing so you never miss a journey into the past. There's something almost magical about letting history whisper softly to you as you unwind. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and imagine a tiny medieval village just waking at the break of dawn. The air is crisp, kissed with the coolness of night, while streaks of pink and gold stretch across the horizon. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows, a sharp, familiar cry that signals the beginning of a new day. Gradually, life stirs. Smoke curls gently from the chimneys of thatched cottages as families coax flames to life, warming porridge or coarse bread over open hearths. The scent of burning wood mingles with the musty breath of livestock. Cows murmur in their pens, waiting for the gentle hands of the milkmaid. Pigs grunt and shuffle in the straw, and in the heart of the village, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer rings out. Ting, 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 as he readies his forge for another long day's work. These are the sensations that greeted a peasant each morning, a familiar mosaic of labor, simplicity, and survival. Life in the Middle Ages was anything but easy. For the common folk, existence was a cycle of relentless toil beneath the crushing weight of the feudal system. Most peasants lived in modest single-room huts with roofs made of straw that had to be replaced every few years due to rot. The walls were built from wattle and daub, a lattice of wood slathered with a mix of mud, straw, and manure. This single space was their kitchen, bedroom, and living area all in one. Their beds, just piles of straw spread over the hard-packed earth. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a worn wooden bench, a rickety table, and if they were fortunate, a straw mattress for the parents. Children often slept above the livestock or right on the dirt floor. Food was as humble as their dwellings. Their diets consisted mostly of barley bread, pottage, a stew of grains and whatever vegetables they could grow, and the occasional addition of herbs. Meat was a rare treasure, only served on special feast days or when an animal grew too old or sick to be useful. Even ale, the beverage of choice, was weak and watery, valued more for its calories than taste. With unsafe drinking water common in towns and cities, everyone, from toddlers to the elderly, drank ale to stay alive. This meager fare, coupled with non-stop physical labor, left most peasants malnourished. Disease was rampant. With weakened immune systems, they were easy prey to ailments like dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, and of course the dreaded plague that would sweep across villages like a shadow. Merciless and swift. To reach the age of 40 was a rarity. Children often didn't survive beyond 5. Death came from illness, injury, malnutrition, or simply the hazards of peasant life. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Mothers and babies both frequently died in the attempt, either during labor or shortly after from infections that no one yet knew how to treat. And yet, despite it all, they endured. The peasantry worked from the moment the sun peaked above the horizon until the stars blinked into the night. Their days were dictated by the turning of seasons and the demands of the land, their fates tethered tightly to the wills of their lords. For in the rigid feudal hierarchy, the peasant was at the very bottom, bound to the whims of those who owned the land. At the top was the king, beneath him lords, ladies, dukes, earls, barons, and knights, each granted land by the crown in return for allegiance and military service. These great nobles, in turn, relied on peasants to farm that land. And not by choice, most peasants were tied to the estate, trapped in a system that allowed little room for escape. In return for the right to till a small plot of land for their own survival, peasants had to labor for the lord, working his fields, tending his animals, maintaining his fences and structures, and surrendering a portion of their crops as rent. It was a life built on sweat, sacrifice, and submission. There were distinctions even among peasants. Freemen, while still beholden to their lord, had slightly more freedom. They could own their own tools and livestock, and in rare cases save enough coin to buy their independence. Villains, despite the ominous name, were not criminals, but rather peasants bound to the land. They couldn't leave the estate without permission. They owned no property of their own, and were subject to the judgment and punishments of their lord. If one died without an heir, everything he owned reverted to the noble. But no matter their legal category, all peasants shared the same dawn-to-dusk struggle. They awoke to the crowing of roosters or the toll of the church bell. With a quick meal in their bellies, they led cows to pasture, pigs to forage in the forest, sheep to graze on distant hills. In spring, the ploughman yoked his oxen and guided the heavy wooden plough through thick earth, back and forth, as sweat dripped from his brow and flies buzzed ceaselessly. After the furrows were carved, the sower followed behind, scattering seeds from a sack slung over his shoulder. He had to pace himself with care, not sowing too much, which could suffocate the plants, nor too little, which would let weeds take over. Birds swooped in, stealing what they could. The sower might shout, wave his arms, or rely on children to run the fields, chasing away feathered thieves. And all of this, every ounce of labor, was subject to nature's unpredictable mercy. 722.7 Once the soil had been turned and the seeds scattered, the peasant's work was far from over. Summer brought long days under a relentless sun, as villagers kept a careful watch over their fragile crops. They fended off hungry animals and stealthy thieves, pulled weeds, hoed furrows, and fought back waves of insect pests, all under the sweltering sky. Every growing season was a gamble, every harvest a fragile hope clinging to the whims of weather and fate. When the golden heads of grain finally ripened, the entire community sprang into action. The harvest was a race against time. Men, women, and children all took up sickles and scythes, moving in lines through the fields, from sunrise to sundown. They cut the tall stalks, tied them into bundles called sheaves, and stacked them high. A single afternoon storm could flatten a field and spoil weeks of effort. So they worked with a kind of desperation, hands blistered and aching, lungs filled with the dust of grain and pollen. Once gathered, the real work began. The sheaves were hauled to the threshing floor, where they were beaten with flails, wooden rods joined by chains, to separate the kernels from the chaff. Thud, thud, thud. The rhythm of labor echoed across the countryside. Next came the winnowing, tossing the grain into the air so the wind could carry away the lighter husks, letting the heavier seeds fall back down. This process, as ancient as farming itself, was both practical and almost meditative in its repetition. The grain then made its way to the Lord's mill, where it was ground into flour. The miller, of course, took his cut, a time-honored tradition that often sparked resentment. Every handful of flour was the result of months of labor, and yet the best of it always went elsewhere. But nothing went to waste. The leftover straw would be put to use, stuffing mattresses, feeding animals, or patching roofs. Even the smallest gleanings left behind in the fields were gathered by the poorest, a practice rooted in biblical tradition. Every scrap mattered. While the men toiled in the open fields, the women managed a world of labor all their own. Their responsibilities were just as demanding, if not more so, carried out quietly and constantly behind the scenes. They rose early to milk cows, churn butter, make cheese, knead dough, and bake loaves in clay ovens. They brewed ale in large, steaming cauldrons and tended to bubbling pots of pottage. They spun wool by hand, wove cloth, cut and stitched garments. Between chores, they cared for children, gathered herbs and firewood, fetched water from the well, and cultivated cottage gardens filled with onions, leeks, beans, and herbs. Their days were filled from end to end with ceaseless work. There was no such thing as rest. Even children had no real childhood by modern standards. As soon as they could walk and follow simple directions, they were expected to help. Tiny feet pattered through fields, chasing away birds, gathering eggs, picking vegetables, and herding geese. There was no school, no toys, no time for idleness. A child's life was simply a shorter, lighter version of an adult's, training for the decades of work ahead. Elderly peasants, too, were expected to contribute in whatever way they could. Those who could no longer labor in the fields might spin thread, patch clothing, tend the hearth, or mind the children. In this world, retirement didn't exist. You worked until your body failed you, and even then, you tried to keep going. This was the life of a peasant in the Middle Ages, a tapestry of hardship woven from unending labor, with threads of devotion, endurance, and fleeting moments of beauty. Their lives were tied inextricably to the land and to the rhythms of nature, and yet, from among these nameless masses, emerged voices that still echo across the centuries. One such voice belonged to William Langland, a ploughman turned poet who lived in the 14th century. Born into poverty, Langland spent his early years behind a plough, guiding oxen through fields, hands blistered and brow scorched by the sun. But there was something restless in him, something that stirred beyond the soil. In stolen moments of stillness, he listened intently to the parish priest's sermons and committed the stories to memory. He taught himself to read and write, an extraordinary feat for someone of his station. From these humble beginnings, he began to craft verses of his own. His most enduring work was Piers Plowmen, a sweeping allegorical poem that follows a humble everyman, Piers, on a spiritual quest through a world riddled with corruption, injustice, and despair. Through Piers's journey, Langland critiqued the greed of the nobility, the hypocrisy of the church, and the crushing weight of the feudal system. In one poignant passage, Piers laments his meagre provisions. I have no penny pullets to buy, no geese or pigs, only 2 green cheeses, a few curds and cream, and an oat cake, and 2 loaves of beans and bran for my children, and by my soul, no bacon, no smoked meat to savour. Langland's verses resonated deeply with the common folk. Here was a voice that understood their struggles, their hunger, their exhaustion. Piers Plowmen spread through manuscript in copies long before the printing press existed, passed hand to hand, recited aloud, cherished like a rare gem of truth. It's a testament to Langland's insight and talent that his poems survived for more than 600 years. His words opened a window into a world too often ignored, the world of the working poor whose silent labor built cathedrals, fed armies, and sustained kingdoms. Through peers, he gave them a champion. Through poetry, he turned their burdens into song. Langland's own life remains largely cloaked in mystery. We know little of how he lived out his final years, but his legacy is written clearly in the pages of his great poem, a legacy of empathy, honesty, and an unwavering belief in the dignity of honest work. Through peers, he captured the soul of the peasant, weary but steadfast, ground down by toil, yet lifted by the faint glimmer of hope. A man whose hands tilled the earth, but whose mind reached towards something more, a better, more just world. NUR 702.7.03. As we leave William Langland and the steadfast figure of his ploughman behind, our journey now turns toward another essential, though often overlooked group of peasants, those who lived their lives side by side with animals. These were the shepherds and goatherds, solitary figures whose quiet dedication kept the manor's livestock safe and thriving. If the ploughman's world was one of toil shared with others in open fields, the life of a shepherd was far more isolated. Day after day they roamed hillsides and meadows alone, the bleating of sheep or the clatter of goats their only companions. There were no friendly conversations to ease the hours, just the wind, the sky, and the rhythms of the flock. Being a good shepherd required more than just patience. It demanded deep instinctive knowledge. A shepherd had to understand his animals, what plants were safe to eat, how to spot the signs of illness or injury, and when a storm was brewing. He had to be part weather forecaster, part veterinarian, part guardian. When a ewe struggled to give birth, it was the shepherd who waded in with practiced hands. When predators threatened, from wolves to wild dogs, he stood between them and his flock, armed with nothing more than a wooden staff and a sling. Nights were no gentler. The shepherd often slept under the stars, wrapped in a heavy woolen cloak against the chill. His only shelter might be a crude lean-to, built from branches, or a natural cave carved into the hillside. For weeks, sometimes months, he might not see another soul, and yet, despite the loneliness and danger, many found a strange peace in this life. There was a quiet nobility in guarding life, in knowing that the wool people wore and the meat they ate began with your watchful care. During the warm months, shepherds followed the receding snowline into the mountains, seeking fresh alpine pastures. There, in the cool, clean air, the sheep would graze and fatten, building strength for the harsh winter ahead. When autumn returned, the long trek back to the lowlands began. Narrow paths slick with rain, and ice made each step treacherous. Avalanches and rock slides were a constant threat, but the work didn't end once they reached the valley. Back at the estate, sheep were shorn of their thick wool, which would be spun into yarn for blankets and clothing. Even through the bitter cold of winter, the shepherd remained on duty, checking for signs of frostbite, illness, or predators bold enough to stalk the snowy hills. This life was not for the faint of heart, and yet there was satisfaction to be found in such a calling. To look upon a flock and know each animal by name, to see them grow strong under your care, these were quiet victories. And in the hush of twilight, as the sun slipped behind the hills and the animals settled into rest, a shepherd might lift his eyes and find peace in the vast beauty around him. The lark's cry, the shimmer of a stream, the soft rustle of the wind in the grass. For many, the solitude of the hills was not a burden, but a kind of spiritual refuge. It was no coincidence that Christ himself was so often depicted as a shepherd, caring, gentle, ever watchful. This divine image lent a deeper meaning to the role. To tend a flock with love and sacrifice was, in some small way, to reflect the sacred. This spiritual aspect is captured beautifully in the old English carol The Shepherd's Song, which paints a tender image of humble herders on the night of Christ's birth. The shepherd upon a hill he sat, he had on him his tabard and his hat. The poem describes their simple lives, their tools, their songs, and how they are visited by angels who lead them to witness the miracle of the Nativity. For medieval peasants, this story carried special meaning, that God would choose to arrive not in a palace, but in a stable, surrounded by animals and shepherds. It was a quiet affirmation that even the lowest station held worth in divine eyes. Yet not every shepherd was a paragon of virtue. Like any profession, it had its rogues, those who neglected their flocks, stole from others, or drank away their coin in taverns. Still, on the whole, shepherds were respected. Their expertise was essential, especially in a time when wool was one of the most valuable commodities in Europe. A skilled shepherd could earn a decent living and hold a place of quiet esteem in the village hierarchy. So the next time you wrap yourself in a woolen shawl or curl beneath a warm blanket, spare a thought for those medieval shepherds, solitary silhouettes on distant hillsides, watching over their flocks beneath the endless sky. And from the hills, we descend once more into the heart of village life. Here, in the smoky kitchens and cramped courtyards of the Lord's Manor, another form of labour took place, one less solitary, but no less grueling. For while the open fields and pastures offered a certain freedom, the manor house and its surrounding outbuildings demanded a different kind of drudgery, endless, often filthy, and always under watchful eyes. Perhaps no job was more dreaded than that of the gong farmer. Before the era of modern sanitation, human waste had to go somewhere, and in the Middle Ages it usually went into cesspits, Holes dug behind homes, beneath buildings, or on the outskirts of villages, but these pits didn't empty themselves. When they filled to the brim, someone had to descend into their foul depths and shovel the sludge out by hand. That someone was the gong farmer. Armed with buckets, shovels, and an iron stomach, the gong farmer would climb down into the muck and start scooping. The stench was unbearable, thick, sour, and clinging to skin, hair, and clothing, no matter how many times one tried to wash it away. The work was nauseating and hazardous. Exposure to waste carried serious risk: dysentery, typhoid, skin infections, and respiratory illness. Gong farmers regularly fell ill, some dying from the very filth they were paid to remove. And they were pariahs. Other villagers avoided them, refusing to speak or share food. They were often forced to live on the fringes of society, kept out of markets and religious ceremonies alike. Even among peasants, the gong farmer was seen as lowly. Yet their work was vital. Without them, villages would become breeding grounds for disease. Streets and homes would overflow with human waste, attracting rats and flies. Epidemics would spread faster. The health of entire communities rested on the shoulders of these reviled laborers. Despite the squalor, there were moments of human connection. Gong farmers often worked in pairs or small teams. They developed a crude camaraderie, telling jokes to distract themselves, inventing songs and chants to keep rhythm while they shoveled. They looked out for one another in the pits, one man above, one below, always listening, always ready to haul up the bucket or help a fallen companion. And from time to time, even a gong farmer might become a hero. One story tells of a man named John, called to clean a monastery's cesspit. As he dug, he heard faint cries, then spotted a small, malnourished child who had fallen in and was barely alive. Without hesitation, John dropped his tools and waded through the filth to rescue the boy. He wrapped him in his own cloak and carried him, reeking and shivering, to the monastery's infirmary. The monks nursed the child back to health, and when the abbot learned of John's deed, he was moved. As thanks, the monastery granted John a small plot of land and a new set of clothes, a rare gift for a man of his standing. For a moment the village paused its judgment. For once they saw not the stench, but the soul. Even in the darkest work, kindness flickered. As the first light of day pierced through the misty skies above the village of Elmwood, life began to stir. The rooster's call echoed from the thatched rooftops, a time-worn alarm clock summoning men, women, and children from their sleep. Their joints stiff from the cold and their straw mattresses damp with morning dew, they rose slowly into the grey-blue dawn, rubbing sore muscles and wiping sleep from their eyes. A quick breakfast, usually just a steaming bowl of thin pottage made from boiled grains and vegetables, was all they could spare time for. Then they set out into the fields and forests, their bodies already aching with the memory of yesterday's toil. There were animals to tend, fences to repair, seeds to sow, firewood to gather. Life was not lived in moments of reflection, but in the relentless rhythm of necessity. Bound to the land by the chains of the feudal order, these peasants had little control over their own destinies. Their labor was not their own. It belonged to their lords, and through them, to the distant authority of the king. The soil beneath their feet was not theirs to claim. The harvest they gathered was not entirely theirs to keep. For most, life ended much as it began. In the same village, often in the same hut, surrounded by the same patch of earth they had tilled since childhood. A peasant might live to see 30 or 40 winters, though disease, injury, and malnutrition ensured many would not last so long. Time, for a peasant, was not measured by years but by seasons. Ploughing in spring, weeding in summer, harvesting in autumn, mending and surviving in winter. Each day began with the toll of the church bell, or the crowing of a cock, and ended in darkness and exhaustion. After a few hours of sleep, it all began again. Even meals reflected the simplicity and scarcity of their lives. The midday repast was quick: a hunk of coarse bread, perhaps a slice of onion or a wedge of cheese, and a sip of watered-down ale. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for feast days or desperate moments when an old animal had to be slaughtered. For supper, a thin vegetable stew would be reheated over the hearth, maybe enriched with a scrap of salted pork, if fortune allowed. As the sun sank below the tree line, families gathered in their dim, smoky huts. The flicker of a hearth fire cast dancing shadows on the rough walls. They ate in silence, too tired to talk, and then collapsed onto beds of straw, wrapped in coarse blankets, huddled together for warmth. Yet among all the exhausting and essential labor of peasant life, none was more demanding, or more central, than working the fields. The ploughman's task was unrelenting. Day after day, he walked behind a pair of oxen or a heavy horse, guiding the crude iron plough through rich, stubborn earth. The plough itself was deceptively simple, a wooden frame with an iron blade and mouldboard. But in the hands of a skilled laborer, it was transformative. It opened up the land, turning the soil in long, dark ribbons, readying it for planting. But the work was punishing. The ploughman had to fight against rocks and roots, adjust the blade for changing ground, and constantly coax or prod the animals forward. Even a good ploughman might only cover an acre in a day, barely enough to feed a family. Worse still, a family's land wasn't always in one place. Due to the way medieval manors were divided, plots were scattered, narrow strips separated by raised ridges of turf. A farmer might have to walk miles just to reach the next bit of his own land. Once the ploughing was done, the sower stepped in. Carrying a large sack of seed slung over one shoulder, he paced the fields, casting grain with each careful motion of his arm. It was a delicate art. Scatter too much, and the young shoots would strangle each other. Too little, and weeds would take over. The wind could shift at any moment, carrying seeds off course. But even if sown perfectly, nature was still in control. Spring rains could flood the fields. Dry spells could crack the soil. Hailstorms, pests, or a single hard frost could wipe out months of labor. For all their effort, medieval farmers lived at the mercy of forces they could not command. Birds were another constant menace. Flocks of crows, starlings, and pigeons would descend upon freshly sown fields, feasting with shameless enthusiasm. The peasants had few tools to stop them. Children were often posted at field edges to wave sticks and shout. Some used rags tied to poles, fluttering in the breeze as makeshift scarecrows. Others relied on rhymes and charms, old words passed down from grandmothers' lips, to ask saints and spirits to guard their crops. One such prayer went, "Holy Mary, Mother mild, bless the seed I sow this day. Let each grain spring forth and grow 100-fold to feed us all." Did it work? Who can say? But when your future hung on a patch of soil and a handful of grain, even a whispered verse offered hope. Once the seed was scattered and the fields walked end to end, the sower would take a breath and rest, but not for long. Before the sweat could dry on his brow, he'd be mending fences, tending animals, or helping in a neighbor's field. In this world, no task existed in isolation. Every hand was needed, every moment counted, and soon enough, harvest would come again. The reaping season was the climax of the agricultural year, a time of immense labor, risk, and community. The wheat and barley had to be cut and stored before the rains returned. There was no room for delay. One unexpected storm could ruin everything. Reapers armed themselves with long scythes, swinging the curved blades through golden stalks in wide arcs. It was backbreaking work. The stalks sliced hands, pollen choked the air, and the sun baked their backs hour after hour. Even the strongest grew weary. Their only breaks were to sharpen the blade or sip from a flask of sour ale. Behind them came the binders, women and older children gathering fallen stalks and tying them into sheaves. Carts creaked under the weight of grain. Threshing floors were prepared and storage bins cleaned. The whole village moved as one, driven by necessity and tradition. Despite the toil, there was camaraderie. Jokes were shared, songs were sung, stories passed from mouth to ear to ease the weight of exhaustion. And when the last bundle was stored and the tools put away, there was a harvest feast, simple, hearty, and full of gratitude. But as you think of the harvester, don't forget the humble shepherd. While others sweated in the fields, the shepherd remained in the high pastures, guarding the flock. His life was lonely, but no less vital. The sheep provided wool for winter, meat for the pot, and trade goods for the Lord. A lost sheep meant lost value. A predator meant disaster. The shepherd's tools were few: a crook to catch stragglers, a sling to chase wolves, and his most loyal companion, a dog trained to herd, guard, and comfort. These dogs were more than tools. They were lifelines, guardians in the night. The shepherd slept rough, under cloaks or makeshift shelters, waking often to check the perimeter. A rustle in the brush could be a fox, or something worse. He moved constantly, keeping the flock fed, guiding them from slope to slope, always watching, always counting. Yet despite the danger, there was something profound in his work. He named the sheep, he spoke to them, he learned their quirks, and in the silence of the hills, he found a strange companionship. 072.705. One shepherd in particular stands out in the quiet folklore of the medieval countryside. Her name was Johanna, a young woman from the German Duchy of Bavaria, known in her village as the Goose Girl. From childhood, Johanna had shown an unusual gift with animals. While other children played or ran errands, she wandered through fields and pastures, coaxing birds from hedgerows, whispering to chickens, calming frightened lambs with gentle hands. By the time she was 12, she was tending a wealthy landowner's geese full-time. When the previous Goose Girl fell victim to illness, Johanna, shy and quiet, was chosen to take her place. At first, it seemed a stroke of good fortune. She took her feathered charges to lush fields each day, watching them waddle and honk, pluck insects from the grass, and preen their wings in the sun. She came to know each one, by voice, by stride, even by mood. There was the bold gander who always took the lead, the anxious mother who fussed endlessly over her nest, the awkward gosling with crooked feet that followed Johanna as if she were its kin. She spoke to them as she worked, sang to them, and they, in turn, seemed to respond. They moved as she directed without fuss. They huddled close at night, tucked in as if under her protection. But the villagers noticed and whispered. They began to watch her with suspicion. The strange girl who spent too much time with animals, who talked to birds as if they were people, who sang to the geese and walked alone at twilight. In an age where superstition clung to every corner of life, the line between gifted and cursed was perilously thin. Trouble came when the village fell into misfortune. Cows stopped giving milk, A blight withered the barley. A pale green fog clung to the mill pond. The people, frightened and searching for a reason, remembered the girl in the fields and her murmuring flocks. They accused Johanna of witchcraft. The landowner was pressured. His labourers refused to work near her. His tenants muttered about curses and omens. Faced with the growing unrest, he sent his men to seize her. But what happened next became legend. As the men approached Johanna in the fields, the geese surrounded her. Not in panic, but in formation. A honking, flapping ring of feathers and fury. They refused to move, snapping at boots and wings beating against shields. Every attempt to get close was met with fierce resistance. The Lord himself came to witness the spectacle, and seeing the devotion of the birds, he paused. No witch, he said at last, could command love like this. He let her go. From that day on, Johanna was left in peace. She lived out her years on the village's edge, her geese still faithfully at her side. Children were told her story in hushed voices, and even those who feared her grew to admire her quiet strength. Some said she was blessed, others touched, but all agreed there was something extraordinary about the girl who walked with geese. Her story became part of the larger tapestry of peasant life, a reminder of the delicate balance between nature, superstition, and survival, a symbol of how quickly favor could shift, and how fiercely even the humblest creatures could defend what they loved. As the morning sun climbed higher over the village, casting golden light across rooftops and pastures, we turn now from the fields and flocks to the very heart of medieval power, the manor itself. Here, among the courtyards and chambers of the Lord's estate, a different kind of hardship awaited. For all the back-breaking labour in the fields, some of the most brutal work took place within the walls of the manor, jobs reserved for the lowest of the low, and few were more despised than the gong farmer. In a world before plumbing, someone had to deal with human waste. Cesspits, dug behind homes and beneath latrines, filled quickly. Left untended, they would overflow, spreading disease and stench through streets and homes. The responsibility for managing this grim necessity fell to a specific class of labourers, those with the strongest stomachs and the least social standing. Gong farmers, named after the old word gong, meaning dung, were the ones who climbed into the fetid depths with buckets and shovels. The work was horrifying. The air was thick with rot and methane. The waste sometimes reached knee-deep, even waist-high in neglected pits. Every breath brought bile to the throat. Every step was treacherous, but it had to be done. These workers, often working in pairs or small crews, developed their own techniques and crude camaraderie. They wore thick leather aprons and wrapped cloths around their faces, though nothing could truly keep the stench at bay. They passed buckets up through narrow holes and hauled carts out to distant dumping grounds. Sometimes they worked at night to avoid public scorn. Other times they worked openly, met with sneers and glares. Their exposure to waste made them vulnerable to all manner of illness, dysentery, typhoid, skin infections, and yet despite the danger they had few options. It was a job no one wanted, but someone had to do it. They were outcasts, denied the right to live near town centres, refused entry to taverns or churches. Children ran from them in the streets. Even fellow peasants turned away. They were considered cursed, or at best unlucky, and yet they were essential. Without them, filth would overrun the villages, rats would multiply, plague would spread more quickly. The very people who avoided them owed their health, perhaps even their lives, to these unsung labourers. Among them were rare stories of quiet heroism. One tale tells of a gong farmer named John, called to a monastery to clear a blocked pit. As he worked, he heard a sound, faint and weak. Investigating further, he discovered a small child, barely alive, who had fallen in and been presumed lost. Without hesitation, John climbed deeper into the pit, lifted the child into his arms, and carried him out. He washed him, wrapped him in his own cloak, and brought him to the monks. The abbot, upon hearing of John's act, rewarded him with a modest plot of land and a clean set of clothes. For a brief moment, the gong farmer was no longer invisible. He was seen, honoured. It was a rare moment of recognition in a world where status mattered more than sacrifice. But it served as a reminder that even in the darkest corners of medieval society, compassion and courage still found a way to shine. So as you imagine the grandeur of castles and the bustle of markets, don't forget those who worked in the shadows. The gong farmers, the ditch diggers, the swineherds. Their work was filthy, dangerous, and thankless. But it was the foundation upon which everything else stood. In a world where survival depended on unceasing labour, the most brutal jobs were often the most necessary. And those who did them, reviled, avoided, mocked, were the ones who kept that world turning. If 72706, as we descend even deeper into the underbelly of medieval labour, we come to a role often overlooked in stories, yet vital to daily survival. The tanner. If the gong farmer toiled in human waste, the tanner waded in filth of another kind. Animal remains, soaked hides, and pits brimming with foul-smelling chemicals. Their craft was essential, and their lives were defined by stench, stains, and seclusion. Leather was a cornerstone of medieval life. Shoes, belts, saddles, gloves, armour, bottles, book bindings. Nearly every household and profession relied on it, and none of it existed without the tanner. Their work began where the butchers ended. Skinned animal hides, fresh, bloody, and slippery, were delivered to the tannery, often located far outside village walls due to the unbearable odor. The first step was to clean the hides of any lingering fat, flesh, or hair. This wasn't done with soap and warm water. No, this was done with aged urine and rotted animal brains. The hides were soaked in vats of stale urine, collected in buckets from villagers, sometimes sold or bartered. The ammonia broke down fats and loosened hair. After days of soaking, the tanner would pull out each hide, bare-handed, and scrape away hair with a curved blade on a wooden beam. Next came the delimbing stage, which used fermented brains or a solution made from pigeon droppings, both rich in enzymes, to soften the hide. The mixture, slimy and pungent, was rubbed and massaged into the leather. The tanner's hands, perpetually raw and calloused, absorbed the smell so deeply that it never fully left them, no matter how often they washed. The hides were then stretched on wooden frames, dried and soaked again in oak bark solution, or tannin-rich liquids for weeks, even months. This final stage gave leather its durability, but the process was long, filthy, and physically punishing. The stench lingered in hair, skin, and breath. The fumes damaged lungs, open wounds often became infected, and yet tanners continued their grim ballet, stirring, scraping, drying, curing, turning death into utility. Socially, tanners were kept at arm's length. They lived on the outskirts of towns, near rivers or marshes where they could dump waste and draw water for soaking. Their homes and workshops were avoided. Few wanted to marry into a tanner's family, and yet despite the stigma, their products were prized. A well-made leather jerkin or saddle could mean the difference between comfort and misery, protection and peril. Their skill was acknowledged, even if their presence was unwelcome. One famous tale tells of a tanner named Elias, whose boots were so expertly made that even a baron's son sought him out. Elias, rough and unshaven, greeted the noble youth not with deference but with indifference. "I'll make your boots," he said, "but they'll be shaped to your foot, not your pride." The young noble laughed and agreed. Weeks later, Elias presented the boots, simple in design but molded to perfection. They fit so well the baron's son declared he would wear nothing else. Rumor spread. Knights, merchants, even abbots sought out the surly craftsman at the edge of the marsh. Elias never moved. He never polished his manners, but his work earned him quiet fame. He died in his workshop, surrounded not by wealth, but by tools worn smooth with use and a wall of shoes, each one made with care. He'd spent his life steeped in stench, but his legacy was one of craftsmanship. His name lived on, passed from boot to boot, whispered in markets far from his muddy doorstep. From tanners we turn to the smiths, the backbone of every village and town, whose forges glowed like miniature suns. Blacksmiths, whitesmiths, farriers, all variants of the same essential craft. If something was made of metal, a smith had touched it. The blacksmith worked with iron, tools, nails, plows, horseshoes, hinges, locks, chains. Their forges rang with the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, the hiss of quenching steel, and the roar of flames fed by bellows. Their hands were massive, hardened by years of pounding red-hot metal into shape. Their skin bore tiny burn scars and deep creases blackened with soot. The blacksmith was both artist and brute, precise in one moment, forceful in the next. Their work required immense strength, but also patience and timing. Too hot, and the metal warped. Too cold, and it cracked. Each blow had to be measured, each bend calculated. The blacksmith stood in heat and smoke all day, lifting heavy tongs and hammering iron until his arms trembled. Children often apprenticed under a master smith at a young age, learning to swing a hammer, stoke the fire, and file edges. Apprenticeships could last 7 years or more. Only after proving their skill could they open a forge of their own. Blacksmiths held a curious position in society. Unlike the tanner, they were central figures in village life. They repaired wagons, shod horses, and made weapons. Warriors respected them. Lords paid them. Even peasants relied on their craft. Yet they were also viewed with wary awe. There was something almost magical in their work, transforming raw ore into gleaming blade or elegant hinge. Superstitions swirled around smiths. Some believed they could charm iron, forge protective amulets, or bless weapons. A few whispered that blacksmiths knew the secrets of fire and shadow, that they had struck deals with spirits who danced in the forge flames. These myths only added to their mystique. Farriers, a cousin trade, specialized in shoeing horses. This required not only blacksmithing skill, but deep understanding of equine anatomy. A poorly shod horse could go lame. A skilled farrier was worth his weight in silver during wartime or trade season. One such farrier, a woman named Marjorie, defied expectations. In a trade dominated by men, she earned her place not with words, but with results. Her shoes never slipped. Her horses never limped. Knights returned from campaigns seeking her touch. She carried herself with quiet authority, her apron smeared with soot, her arms strong from years of lifting hooves and hammering nails. She didn't speak much, but when she looked at a horse, she seemed to listen with her eyes. She adjusted not only shoes, but saddles and reins, sensing where a beast hurt or strained. Horses calmed under her care. Owners trusted her without question, and though some mocked her, called her iron-handed or worse, no one could deny her skill. When she passed, old knights wept and stable boys carved her likeness on the door of the forge, Marjorie of the Hammer. From the depths of dung pits to the blaze of the forge, the medieval world pulsed with hands at work. Dirty, raw, skilled, forgotten. These were the hands that built it all. As we move beyond the forge and the flames, we turn now to a job both sacred and sorrowful, the grave digger. In the medieval world, death was not a rare visitor. It loomed over every household, lingered in every village, and carved its presence into daily life. Disease, famine, injury, childbirth, any of these could claim a life in an instant. And when they did, someone had to prepare the dead for rest. That someone was the grave digger. Often an older man, sometimes a monk, but just as often a poor labourer. The grave digger worked on the edge of the parish cemetery. His tools were simple: a spade, a mattock, a lantern, and a wheelbarrow. His job was to break the earth, day or night, rain or shine, feast day or famine. Digging graves was no small task. The soil could be frozen in winter or sticky and wet in spring. Some cemeteries had seen generations buried in the same ground, and it was not uncommon for bones to surface mid-dig. The gravedigger would pause, gather the remains with care, and place them reverently in a charnel pit or bone house nearby. But it was not just the digging that made the work difficult. It was the proximity to grief, to mourning, to loss. The gravedigger stood silently as families wept, as priests read Latin rites over simple coffins or cloth-wrapped bodies. He did not speak unless spoken to. He bowed his head. He waited, and when the last mourner left, he finished the burial alone. There was a quiet dignity to his work, a recognition that in the end, all stood equal before the grave. Rich or poor, noble or commoner, all returned to the soil. The grave digger was the final caretaker, the last to hold the dead, yet during times of plague, this role became something altogether more terrifying. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, death no longer came in ones or twos. It came in waves. Whole families perished within days. Villages lost half their populations. Bells tolled constantly. The air itself felt poisoned. In such chaos, the gravedigger became one of the most important and most endangered figures in society. They could no longer dig proper graves for each body. Instead, they were ordered to prepare mass burial pits, long, deep trenches where corpses were laid side by side, sprinkled with quicklime and hurriedly covered with earth. There was no time for ceremony, no time for prayer. These plague pits became infamous. Many were never marked. Some were rediscovered centuries later, during construction or war, when bulldozers unearthed rows of skeletons, arms crossed, teeth bared in eternal silence. The gravedigger worked quickly and alone. Others avoided him, fearing he carried the sickness. Some wore masks of cloth or herbs. Others smeared vinegar under their noses to fight the stench of decay. The bodies were wrapped tightly, sometimes not at all, and every breath, every touch carried the risk of infection. Yet still, they dug. One tale survives from a village in northern France. A gravedigger named Emile, gaunt and grim, continued to work even as others fled. He buried neighbors, friends, his own wife and son. When asked why he remained, he said only, "The dead must be tended, even now." Eventually, Emile too fell ill, but by then he had buried more than 300 souls. The priest said a final prayer over him, then picked up the spade Emile had left behind and began to dig. In that simple handoff, a truth emerged. Grief could not stop the work. Someone always had to step in. From the shadows of the cemetery, we now enter the warmth and chaos of the medieval kitchen, a domain ruled by another unsung labourer, the cook. Contrary to modern romantic visions of castle banquets and roasted boar, most medieval kitchens were hot, cramped, and filled with pressure. Whether in the manor house, the monastery, or the travelling camp of a noble lord, cooks were responsible for transforming raw, sometimes questionable ingredients into nourishing meals, and they had to do it quickly, consistently, and with little margin for error. A cook's day began before dawn. Fires had to be lit and kept at the perfect heat, which meant tending to coals, adjusting dampers, and sometimes crawling beneath the hearth to stoke the flame. Water had to be hauled, vegetables cleaned, meats butchered, bread baked, porridge stirred endlessly to avoid burning. In wealthier households, a cook might command assistants, spit-turners, pastry makers, potboys, and sauce specialists. But in smaller homes or monasteries, one person did it all. They worked with knives so dull from overuse they had to be sharpened daily. They stirred thick stews with wooden paddles the size of oars. They used herbs not just for flavour, but to mask the scent of meat gone slightly off. And they moved constantly, bending, lifting, shouting, sweating, while smoke stung their eyes and hot grease sizzled on skin. Menus were dictated by the church calendar. Certain days forbade meat, others required fasting. Still others called for elaborate feasts where a cook might be asked to produce 3 courses with only turnips, barley, and salted fish. Creativity was not a luxury, it was a necessity, and failure was not tolerated. A burnt dish could mean punishment. A noble's displeasure might lead to dismissal, or worse, disgrace. But the best cooks were revered. Tales were told of one such cook, Branwen, who served a great lady in Wales. With only roots, herbs, and a pinch of flour, she crafted stews that soothed the sick. Her bread was said to rise without yeast. Her roast rabbit could bring silence to a quarrelsome hall. They said she never used a recipe. She listened to the pot, to the hiss of oil, the creak of the lid. She knew when food was done by scent alone, and though she never married, she fed 3 generations of the same household. When she died, the lady's son ordered a kitchen knife engraved with her name and hung it above the hearth, Branwen's hand. Cooking was survival. Cooking was care. It was memory. It was power. And yet, as the cook's fire burned low, another fire crackled in the most peculiar corners of the medieval world, among travelling performers, tricksters, and storytellers. These were the jesters and fools, jugglers and fire-breathers, those who brought laughter where there was little else to be found. Their work was not with spades or blades, but with wit, courage, and timing. A good fool could save his own life with a well-timed joke. A clever juggler might earn more in a night than a ploughman did in a week. But their life was just as uncertain. They walked from town to town, dodging suspicion, seeking coin, and avoiding the church's wrath. In courts, the jester was given license to speak truths others could not. Hidden behind painted faces or floppy hats, they mocked kings and courtiers, highlighting hypocrisy in verse and rhyme. In villages, they performed in markets or at weddings, tumbling, mimicking, dancing, risking injury and humiliation for a handful of bread or a coin or two. One story tells of a jester named Marot, whose tongue was so sharp he's once made a bishop blush. Rather than punish him, the bishop asked for another verse. Marot smiled and said, "I have many, but you may only understand them when your hat's on backward," to which the bishop laughed and wore his mitre backwards the rest of the day. The fool's life was dangerous, yes, but also oddly free. They were not tied to land or lord. Their power lay in observation. They saw everything, remembered everything, and turned the world's cruelty into comedy, its injustice into jest. They too were workers, labourers of laughter, architects of absurdity, and though their jobs required no field or forge, they bore the same burden, to survive, to serve, and to be remembered. Not all work in the medieval world happened in fields, kitchens, or churches. Some of it took place in silence, in candlelit corners and behind thick stone walls, where pain was not always seen, but deeply felt. These were the hospitals, and at their heart were the caregivers, monks, nuns, lay sisters, herbalists, and attendants who bore no armour, but waged quiet war against suffering. The hospital was not what we know today. It was often a wing of a monastery, or a converted hall supported by a noble family. Beds were wooden frames with straw mattresses. Sheets were rare. Medicine was scarce. The air smelled of herbs, sweat, and slow decay. The caregivers were not trained in modern science. They had no antibiotics, no x-rays, no syringes. Their knowledge came from ancient texts, Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, and from generations of oral wisdom passed down by midwives and wise women. They believed in humours and balance. They used leeches and poultices, boiled bark and ground roots, and yet, within their hands, hope flickered. They tended the sick without masks or gloves. They bathed the fevered, fed the weak, changed bandages soaked with pus and blood. They whispered prayers at every bedside and held the hands of the dying. They didn't always heal, but they remained. One nun, Sister Agnes, was known across 3 counties. She could feel a fever coming just by touching a child's cheek. Her salves soothed burns, her teas eased coughing fits. She worked without rest, her wimple always stained, her hands cracked from lye soap and winter air. When a plague swept through the valley, she refused to leave her post. Her sisters died around her one by one, but she stayed. "God," she said, "does not abandon the suffering, nor shall I." She too fell ill, but recovered, and when she rose from her straw bed, she walked the halls again, barefoot and pale, humming hymns as she brought broth to the broken. Caregivers like Agnes were saints in all but title. They were the quiet backbone of healing in a brutal age. They offered more than remedies, they offered dignity. And they weren't alone. Midwives too played a vital role, often unsung and unsupported. Their work began with a knock on the door in the dead of night, a woman in labour, a child coming too soon, a birth gone wrong. They carried no bag of tools, only towels, herbs, calm hands, and a knowledge carved from countless nights of blood, breath, and waiting. A midwife had to know when to wait and when to act, when to press and when to pray. She stood in kitchens and stables, beside beds and hearths, delivering life into this world, while sometimes watching it leave just as quickly. One midwife, Edith, delivered more than 600 children in her lifetime. She never lost her temper. She never left before the mother slept. People said she had the hands of a mother and the eyes of a hawk. She stitched tears, soothed tears, and buried more than one baby with her own shawl. She was accused once of witchcraft by a man whose wife died in labour. She stood trial, she answered plainly, and the women of the village stood beside her. One by one they testified, told their stories, showed the children she had delivered now walking and thriving. She was acquitted, and when she passed years later, they buried her with a ribbon from every child she delivered, tied together into a wreath. The work of healing, of birthing, of tending. These were brutal jobs too, not because of filth or danger, but because of heartbreak. To care was to be vulnerable, to help was to risk loss. Yet thousands chose this path. Every day, even the scribes tucked in scriptoria, hunched over parchment, endured their own form of brutality. Imagine copying a single manuscript by hand, letter by letter, hour after hour, for months. No erasers, no breaks, eyes strained, fingers cramped, backs bent beneath candlelight. The scribe's work demanded perfect precision. A single smudge could ruin a page. Ink had to be mixed from oak galls and iron salts. Quills sharpened to fine points. Mistakes scraped away with knives. The margins were filled with tiny notations, corrections, and sometimes secret jokes. One monk, after copying a particularly dull theological text, wrote in the margin, "Oh, for a drink, my back aches, my eyes sting, may God reward me, for no man ever shall." Scribes preserved knowledge. They carried ancient wisdom through the dark ages of war and plague. Without them, stories would be lost, saints forgotten, and science delayed by centuries. Their pain brought permanence. Their boredom built bridges across generations. And what of the builders, the masons and stonecutters who carved churches from cliffs, raised cathedrals from quarries, and shaped history with chisel and mallet? These men risked their lives with every swing. They climbed wooden scaffolds 100 feet above the earth, balancing stone in crude pulleys. One misstep, one faulty beam, and they'd fall to their deaths. Yet they worked on day after day, chiseling angels into arches and saints into spires. Their hands bled from raw limestone, their lungs filled with dust, and still they sang as they worked, old chants that echoed off stone walls, binding the living to the sacred. Some were master masons, keepers of secrets and geometry. Others were mere labourers, but all of them together made awe visible. They turned faith into form, and centuries later, we still walk beneath their arches, marvelling. Toward the end of the day, when the tools were put away and the sun dipped low, the workers would sit on stones or logs, wiping sweat from their brows. They shared bread, shared silence, looked at what they had made, and perhaps in that golden hour they felt something more than tired. Perhaps they felt part of something, a story, a wall, a world. In every village, every city, there were those whose names were never recorded, but whose labour lives on in wood and stone, paper and memory. They were not heroes in the traditional sense, but they were the breath of their age, the quiet engine of history. They were the ones who built it all. War 727 in unnamed, and so we return, once more, to the village. The sun has dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the fields. Smoke curls gently from chimney tops. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer has quieted. The last of the children are called indoors. Another day has ended, and with it, 1,000 labours completed. The medieval world was built not by kings and knights alone, but by countless hands moving in rhythm with the earth. The weaver at her loom, the cooper fitting staves, the washerwoman bent over the river, the woodcutter knee-deep in snow, the mason balancing stone, the reeve keeping tallies, the midwife wiping blood from her apron, each one vital, each one forgotten, but forgotten only in name. Their work lives on, not just in the stone of cathedrals or the worn timber of cottages, but in the very structure of our world. Roads paved by labourers now guide our cars. Fields once sown by hand still yield crops beneath machines. Walls once lifted stone by stone now frame the outlines of our towns. The past, though buried, still breathes beneath our feet. There's something humbling in that, something grounding, to imagine for a moment what it was to live like them, to wake each day not in pursuit of ambition, but survival, to labour not for fame, but for food, to build not for glory, but so that someone, somewhere, might stay warm through the winter. Their names didn't make it into the chronicles, but their effort carved itself into every moment that followed. We often speak of history as kings, battles, treaties, but in truth, history is also a calloused hand lighting a fire before dawn, a tired voice humming as bread is needed, a child carrying water up a hill. We see ourselves in them if we look closely, their joys, their griefs, their stubbornness, their pride. These echoes haven't faded, they've simply changed clothes, and perhaps the most brutal part of all these jobs wasn't the filth or danger or exhaustion. It was the silence, the invisibility, to toil and never be thanked, to give and never be remembered, to suffer and have the world move on without a pause. But tonight we pause. We pause to honour them, the ploughmen and shepherds, the gong farmers and smiths, the cooks, the jesters, the scribes, the builders, the birth bringers and the death watchers, the ones whose stories weren't told because no one bothered to write them down. We pause because without them, the castles would crumble, the knights would go barefoot, and the lords would starve. Without them, nothing else could exist, and yet they asked for so little. A dry bed, a loaf of bread, a moment of peace, maybe a song or a smile, a prayer not to be buried alone. So much of their lives were spent in motion, chopping, digging, hauling, sowing. Their world moved slowly by our standards, and yet it demanded everything. It took their strength, their time, sometimes their lives. But they gave, again and again, because the alternative was worse, because someone had to. And there's something extraordinary in that. Not heroic, not grand, but deeply, achingly human. They remind us that it's not the loudest lives that shape the world. It's the quiet, persistent ones, the ones who show up, who stay, who endure. Not because they're fearless, but because they don't have the luxury of fear. If you've ever felt unseen in your own labor, if you've ever worked in the dark or behind the scenes, or for someone else's comfort, then you are kin to them, and you are not alone. History doesn't always remember by name, but it remembers by impact, by imprint, by the 1,000 little things that together keep the world turning. And so tonight, as you rest, think of them, not as relics of a distant past, but as mirrors. They were tired too. They wanted rest too. They loved, they lost, they laughed, they hoped, and in their labor, brutal and beautiful, they built a world that still holds us. So rest well. You've earned it too. At 7:02:7:10. So now, as the fire crackles low and shadows stretch across the walls of this quiet space, we come to the end of our journey. A journey not through battlefields or thrones, but through the unseen lives that kept the medieval world breathing. The most brutal jobs in history weren't always bloody. Sometimes they were simply invisible, performed day after day, without audience, without applause. Jobs that demanded strength of the body, yes, but also of spirit. Jobs done not for glory, but for survival, for family, for duty. And still there is something luminous about them, because in those moments, those ordinary aching moments, humanity shines most clearly. Not in conquest, but in care. Not in noise, but in constancy. To wake, to work, to endure. This is its own kind of grace. We began with the peasant rising at dawn. We walked with the shepherd into the hills. We stood with the ploughman behind his oxen, the blacksmith beside his forge, the tanner at his reeking vats. We bent low with the grave digger, held still with the midwife, copied words with the scribe, and laughed with the fool. We lit the fire, baked the bread, carried the pail, whispered the prayer, dug the pit, turned the spit, patched the roof, held the child, buried the dead, and perhaps as we passed gently into sleep, we carry their rhythm with us, because some part of us remembers what it is to labor without recognition, to offer care that no one sees, to hold hope quietly in the middle of exhaustion, to find a kind of peace in repetition, a kind of meaning in the mundane. And maybe that's why we return to these stories, not for spectacle, but for stillness, for the reminder that a life need not be loud to be worthy. That dignity doesn't shout, it lingers, in the calloused hand, in the warm bowl, in the silent promise to show up again tomorrow. As you close your eyes tonight, know this: you are part of this story too. In your own tasks, whatever they may be, you echo the same quiet strength. You walk the same path of effort, patience, and perseverance. You carry water of your own, you tend your own fields, you forge your own tools, speak your own kindness, sing your own song into the silence, and that matters. So rest now, knowing that the world spins forward not because of grand moments, but because of small ones, repeated faithfully. Sleep well, gentle soul. May your labor be light tomorrow, and may you always remember, even in the hardest, quietest work, you are not alone.